All right, and now we're going to try and analyze all of this. Amy Walter is the national editor at the Cook Political Report. Ben Domenech is the founder and publisher of The Federalist, and Ezra Klein is the editor-in-chief at Vox.com. Ben, I want to start with you in Puerto Rico. We just assess the blame here. Obviously, there's blame to go around. Where does it lie?
Well, I think that there's a significant blame to be placed in a lot of different places. But just first off, my family is Puerto Rican. We have many friends and relatives who are there right now. They're going through an incredibly challenging time. Puerto Rico is different in a lot of key ways from Florida and Texas. You can't just get the debris out of a place in the same way when it is an island. And I think that one of the biggest problems that Puerto Rico has is that their infrastructure was not in a good position even before this storm arrived. Part of the problem in Puerto Rico is that the politics of the island has been entirely driven by the question of status, what your position is on statehood versus Commonwealth versus independence. And that's led to a lot of different people getting elected politically who can take a position on that and argue for it in a fluent way, but aren't necessarily the kind of infrastructure-minded, diligent workers that you want to be in place when a crisis like this comes to bear. Clearly, the aid got to the island in a lot of different places, but did not get to the people who needed it. It hasn't been delivered that last mile. And that is going to require, I think, a lot more effort than what you might see for a domestic storm in a similar situation, in part because the people who are there in leadership on that island have not had the experience of having to deliver with such a heavy lift in the past.
So, Ezra, that's the local view. On the federal issue, Marco Rubio said basically that the problem with the response was they were planning for a certain kind of disaster, and it turned out to be more tricky in Puerto Rico. So isn't that the job in a disaster, to adapt at the federal level and know that Puerto Rico is different than Florida and Texas, and therefore be able to basically adapt? That was kind of the promise of having a businessman in the Oval Office. What's your sense of that?
Adapt and predict and focus, right? I mean, there are things they've said about Puerto Rico about how it's different, and it is different. But when Donald Trump comes out and says the thing about Puerto Rico is it's an island in the middle of the ocean, that was pre-existing knowledge. We knew that before Hurricane Maria hit. There was a real lack of focus in the White House. I mean, every bit of reporting we've seen so far, and also what we saw publicly from Donald Trump during the critical first days after the hurricane, has shown this. This is a hurricane that was predicted. It hit Puerto Rico in much the way we thought it was going to hit Puerto Rico. They didn't have a high-level White House meeting on this, including Trump, but with the right people in the room, for 6 days. And during that period, it's not like Donald Trump was out there talking incessantly about Puerto Rico or at the White House focusing on Puerto Rico. He was playing golf. He was picking fights with the NFL. Focus in any White House, given the number of things they need to do, is one of the truly scarce key qualities. You need to have people running herd on these kinds of projects if you're going to be able to adapt, if you're going to be able to bring to bear the amount of resources you need to. And this was, at the very least, a failure of management and a failure of focus.
Amy, the focus, at least in part from the president recently, has been on the mayor of San Juan. How is that a help?
It does. It is the short answer. And Look, I think that has been the challenge for the president all along, which is when there's criticism that comes at him, his response is to lash back. And even those who are supporters of the president say, I wish you would just stop tweeting and start, to Ezra's point, keep focused. But fundamentally, I think, unfortunately, what this does is it brings us back to this place where if you are on a certain side of the aisle, you're going to side, you put on your jersey and you side with the mayor. If you're on the other side of the aisle, you put on your jersey and you side with the president. And once again, we're back to taking something that is a really serious humanitarian crisis, and it's become now a test of your political fealty. Are you in this tribe or this tribe? And this, I think, is both where we are at this place in time, and it's also what so many voters hate about where we are at this place in time. And that the unifying theme that should be, we're in a crisis, let's all get together, has now become a test of who are you, more in alliance with.
Ben, let's switch to taxes here. Chuck Schumer has just given the opposition view, and I don't think he took a breath. What's your sense of both? Let's start first with policy of this. What do you make of the unified Republican framework?
Well, I think that Republicans are obviously far more comfortable talking about taxes than they are talking about health care.
And the president, for sure.
They are happy to run into the teeth of any kind of oppositional argument on the tax policy issue because they're so used to making these arguments and they come so naturally to them. I think, though, that one of the things things that Chuck Schumer brought up that is going to be a critical question here is this issue of state and local tax deductibility. There are a number of different Republicans who come from blue or purple states that are in these suburbanite sort of areas that have benefited from this state and local tax deduction in the past. That's a lot of different House members who are in states like California who are going to have a tough time going to their constituents and basically saying, yes, I'm going to remove this out of an act of fairness, as you said, to the taxpayers of Alabama, but they aren't elected by the taxpayers of Alabama. And I think that this could turn out to be one of the stickier subjects that they have to deal with in terms of the debate within their conference on this issue.
The state and local tax issue. Ezra, where do you take a hold of this plan?
So right now, I think it's important to say the plan lacks a lot of details. For instance, we don't know if there will be 3 or 4 tax brackets. But given what we have, the Tax Policy Center, which does the best tax modeling work in Washington, looked at it. And I think there are 3 numbers that are worth thinking about here. So far, Republicans have said this is going to be deficit neutral, and it's going to retain the current code's progressivity. So Tax Policy Center looked at the plan, made what assumptions they could make, and said, if you sort of do the best model you can, this plan is going to give the top 1% a tax cut of $130,000 on average each. People in the middle class a tax cut of about $660. It's very hard to look at those numbers and say that's a progressive plan. And then it's going to cost about $2.5 trillion. So somehow, if you're going to have a deficit neutral, you got to pay for all that $2.5 trillion. And if you're going to have it be as progressive as the current code is, you're going to have to somehow change deductions and put in a bracket and do a lot of things that are going to really shift that. I am very skeptical they're going to make those changes.
And also, you're fixing the deficit impacts of the plan, which means you don't have any money from growth to pay for the underlying deficit and debt issues, which they have talked about in the past. Yeah. Amy, giving the numbers that Ezra just talked about, the president campaigned for the forgotten man, the little guy. How do you think that plays out when the numbers are disparate and when obviously the Democrats are making this case about that it's basically just going to the top?
I think there are a couple of challenges Republicans have. The first is, as we've seen with health care, being the opposition party, it was very easy to craft a message on healthcare. When you're the party in charge and actually have to pass something where there's give and takes, where you're going to have to put this coalition together, it's much more difficult. I think tax reform is going to fit in that same boat. It is something that is much more unifying for Republicans, but they still run up against, and I think Ben's exactly right on the issue of the state and local tax issue, as well as other issues that are going to come up as they're putting this framework together. The second is that this tax debate, much like healthcare, is being driven by the clock and the calendar more so than by deeper policy arguments. You talk to Republicans who are very upset they didn't get healthcare through. They say we have to get tax reform done. It's almost a non-issue about what it looks like as much as we got to get this done because if we go into 2018 without a tax cut, without anything to tell our constituents, we're going to get killed in the midterm elections. I don't think that's a great way to make policy, is being worried about running out of time for budget reconciliation, running out of time before a midterm election.
Now, Ben, in 1986, tax reform took 2 years.
Yes, they are definitely rushing, I think, to get this done with a mind on what's going to happen in 2018. One of the things that's not going to happen in 2018, obviously, is that Bob Corker is not going to be running for re-election. I think that
Republican senator from Tennessee.
I think that story is actually one of the most significant stories to happen this past week, which had a lot of different significant stories because it's step one, I think, of a wave of retirements, people deciding not to run for re-election within the 18 and 20 cycle. There's a number of Republican senators who've had enormous influence over that conference for a long time, but they're now all in their 80s and they're approaching that point where they have to decide whether they want to stick around in Washington or not. I think the fractiousness of debates like these on healthcare and on taxes increases the likelihood that they exit.
Yeah, and if they don't pass a tax cut, this is what a lot of Republicans are worried about on the House side, that you are going to see a wave of retirements come January, February. Folks said, we were here for a year, we had total control, we didn't get stuff done. I don't know if I want to be here for longer. That is a very, very big concern.
And then you had an Alabama primary this week, Ezra, where some of these issues were already playing out. The Republican primary.
And a primary where it looks like it's only going to become more fractious. If Roe does win that, that's a real problem for Mitch McConnell. I do just want to say one thing about the tax effort, which is there was a deal here. I was talking to a top Democratic staffer for the kind of Democrat they need to get in the Senate and could get. And he said, look, we could have done corporate repatriation for infrastructure, middle-class tax cuts, and corporate tax reform. And Democrats would have helped on that. They would have been involved in that. Think about the Trump administration, this Republican Party. They don't try. they could try to get bipartisan support and then go for the partisan bill if that fails, but they don't try at the front end. And so this is going to be a much more fractious plan. And by the end of it, if it doesn't go well, Democrats are not going to need to come on board. And that's a political mistake they're making.
But consider why Roy Moore is even the nominee. Moore is the nominee because Mitch McConnell decided that Mo Brooks, a conservative congressman in the Ted Cruz mode, who was also a critic of McConnell, was someone who needed to be destroyed in the primary. He parachuted in millions of dollars, getting rid of this conservative candidate, thinking that Moore would be an easy candidate for Luther Strange to beat. As it turned out, Strange was too conflicted given his relationship to the governor of Alabama and the appointment that happened. That ended up dragging him down, and that's why you end up with someone like Moore instead of potentially a more traditional but problematic conservative from McConnell's perspective.
All right, we're going to have to end it there because Bob Schieffer is here, and he'll take the chair away from you. He's coming up right next, so stay with us.